Often, the best place to hide something is in plain sight. Our mind slips into the habit of the everyday, and what is right before our eyes becomes invisible. We fail to see the trees for the forest, as it were. It is unsurprising then that some of the most disorienting and shocking concepts in philosophical history are not to be found in some arcane, esoteric tome, but are lurking right there among some of the most canonical texts and figures in philosophical history. Of course, this shouldn't be terribly surprising. Often the great works of genius are precisely ones that become canonical. And genius, of course, operates not only at the limits of what is considered acceptable, but at the very limits of sanity itself. How often does the avant-garde or insanity of one generation become the most banal truths of another? This reminds me that Schopenhauer once noted that truth passes through three stages. First, it is ridiculed, then it is violently suppressed, and finally, it is accepted as simply being self-evident. Indeed, when I think about Schopenhauer's own philosophy, I think we are still in the first phase of accepting his truth. We are simply too cowardly to do otherwise. I think this odd journey of the truth, just how shocking ideas can remain unseen or dormant in the philosophical canon, is nowhere more apparent than in the works of the great philosopher, Plato. Here we have a genuine enigma, a philosopher deeply committed to analytical argumentation and geometric clarity. As you probably know, there was a warning over the gates of the academy: let no one enter that does not master geometry. But Plato was also a philosopher dedicated to the idea that a certain kind of insanity sent from the gods was an authentic means to the divine truth. That ecstatic, non-rational ways of knowing were not only possible, but preferable to the dialectic of philosophy. Just how do mania and logos, reason and insanity, interact with one another as we search for this divine truth? In this episode of Esoterica, we're going to explore the mania, or the divine madness described by Plato and later more Hermetic philosophers, such as Ficino, Cornelius Agrippa, and Giordano Bruno. I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and welcome to Esoterica, where we explore the arcane side of history, philosophy, and religion. Whitehead, the founder of process metaphysics, once noted that all of Western philosophy was simply footnotes to Plato. When I was a younger student of philosophy, I positively balked at this characterization. Many of my favorite philosophers and philosophical schools, such as the Stoics, the Scholastics, Spinoza, and Deleuze, could certainly be characterized as non-Platonic or even anti-Platonic in their philosophical orientation. But the older I get and the deeper and more Plato I study, the more that this quip becomes inescapably true. Though, one place where I think we've largely lost this Platonic thread is in Plato's epistemology, or his theory of knowledge. As you probably know, Plato held that knowledge, or justified true belief, was only possible of objects that were eternal and unchanging. The only such entities that existed in this way, Plato called the forms, or the ideas, which are something like quasi-divine universal concepts like goodness, justice, beauty, oneness, and equality. For Plato, the soul has a kind of prenatal knowledge of these divine forms, and all knowledge is actually remembering, or anamnesis. Thus, when I produce a geometric proof of, say, the Pythagorean theorem, I'm not learning something new. Rather, my soul is remembering the geometric truths that I knew before I were born. Plato also describes a kind of graduated scheme of knowledge. This is the so-called divided line found in the Republic. There, knowledge passes through mere eikaisia, something like imagination or opinion, through pistis, or empirical sense data, onward up to dianoia, knowledge provided by pure mathematical contemplation. Onward still to the most perfect form of knowledge, noesis, in which the soul is able to comprehend and grasp the final reality of the forms. It is in this final form of knowledge, noesis, in which the soul grasps the ultimate reality itself, the good. In typical classes of philosophy, students are trained to climb up this ladder using the tools of logic and dialectic. Starting with the most basic geometric diagrams of the Meno, before climbing to the pure abstract dialectical ideas of the Parmenides, with a long pit stop, of course, in the Republic. Regardless of the route taken, the almost exclusive focus in teaching Plato is on the use of logic and dialectic to climb up the ladder of knowledge. Here, we use logic and mathematics to mount up the divided line, ever reaching for the divine world of the forms. But in most pedagogies, the exclusive tools to be used here are logic and dialectic. To be sure, this path is certainly to be found in the philosophical ideas and the dialogues of Plato. Rigorous, logical, if not somewhat bewildering arguments are given for a wide range of philosophical ideas in Plato's dialogues, everything from the existence and the eternality of the soul to the very nature of social justice itself. Plato in no way eschews dialectic and logic. These are certainly means by which we can reach up the divided line from mere opinion and imagination to contemplate the pure beauty and eternality of the forms themselves. But a radically alternative avenue is also available if one were to read Plato's works carefully, one that is basically ignored or suppressed in mainstream academic philosophy. It seems that if we were to speak of the path of logos by which we are to arrive at the truth through logic, then we must also speak of the path of the mania, by which we may also arrive at divine knowledge through a kind of madness. Plato's discussion of the mania, or the madness sent from the gods, is principally to be found in two discussions, one in the Phaedrus and the other in the famed Symposium. As you may know, the common bond that ties both the Phaedrus and the Symposium together is that they're both discussions on the nature of love. And it is in the Phaedrus that Plato reveals one of his most shocking and tantalizing philosophical doctrines, that the mania, or divine madness, are actually sent from the gods and are capable of revealing ultimate fundamental truths about reality to the person undergoing them. Indeed, for Plato, the mania are proof that the soul is capable of reaching back into the divine realm, and that the mania of love can bear the lover to the place of true wisdom. Plato even goes so far as to say that the clever person, the person that relies on strict argumentation and logic, will simply not understand these truths, that the person born on the mania alone will prove capable of actually understanding his secret teaching. He then goes on to describe the four mania that he has in mind. The first is the prophetic mania, represented by the various oracles to be found in the ancient Greek world, especially the Delphic oracle, and their ability to tell the future, although often very obscurely. The second mania, the telestic mania, is perhaps the most mysterious. This mania seems to be linked to the curative power of the various mystery cults that existed in Plato's day, especially the cult of Eleusis and Bacchus. The third is the poetic mania, in which divine inspiration flows from the world of the muses into the mind of the poet, especially the religious poet. And finally, we come to the most important for Plato, the erotic mania, or the mania of love, in which gazing upon the physical beauty of young men prompts the soul to begin its upward journey to the transcendental world of the forms, eventually to gaze upon the sublime, transcendental form of beauty itself. Plato is disappointingly terse in his discussion of the mania, especially given that they are declared to be superior to philosophy in reaching up to the world of the divine truth. Indeed, they're only really discussed in the Phaedrus from about 244a to 245c, and then only in a few places to be found throughout Plato's works, such as in the Symposium. One wonders, if Plato gives such a pride of place to the mania, why does he discuss them so sparingly? Perhaps they reflect a more esoteric dimension of Plato's own thought. We do know that the documents that have come down to us, the dialogues, were primarily written for a public audience, while his discourses, which are now lost, were primarily meant to be studied in the academy itself. It could be that the mania are simply hinted at in the dialogues and more fully explored in the discourses. We'll never know. Further, and I do think this is really germane, the language that Plato uses when discussing the mania is very reminiscent of the kind of mystery language that one sees in classical literature about the various mystery cults that existed in Plato's time. These mystery religions, such as the mystery of Eleusis or the mystery of Bacchus, were carefully guarded secrets, and one of Socrates' friends and lovers, Alcibiades, was greatly chided for having let loose some of these secrets in public. Further, we also know that Plato and Socrates felt highly enough of these mysteries to undergo them themselves, subordinating their philosophical analysis and acumen to the divine knowledge to be gained by undergoing the various mysteries. Perhaps what we have here in Plato is an attempt to combine the philosophical truths achieved by logic and dialectic with the divine truths that are revealed only through the mystery religions. Perhaps Plato, in his own philosophical project, is attempting a grand synthesis of both of these means to the truth. To this point, it should be borne in mind that in the symposium, where we reach the very apex of the discussion and we're about to understand the fundamental nature of love, it isn't Socrates/Plato, nor even a man, that does the heavy lifting here. It's Diotima, a priestess and prophetess, that reveals the true nature of what love is to the various people at the symposium. Plato himself forgoes his usual ventriloquism of using Socrates to speak Plato's ideas, and rather puts them into the mouth of Diotima. By invoking the voice of a priestess to reveal the divine nature of love, the task here is being taken from a philosopher and given over, basically, to an oracle, or someone who speaks on behalf of the gods. And finally, it should be pointed out that Plato is curiously specific about the location of the dialogue of the Phaedrus. It takes place under a tree near a river outside Athens, only about a quarter mile from when the rituals of the Eleusis mystery took place. Of course, I'm willing to admit that my read here is a bit circumstantial and somewhat speculative, but Plato was indeed a genius and a very careful writer. It would be foolish, I think, to simply ignore these kinds of signposts as he leaves them in his texts. And indeed, in his famous seventh letter, Plato admits to harboring esoteric and secret ideas. Just what these ideas were remains a topic of enormous speculation. But it seems to me that some elaboration of the mania, insofar as he praises them to the degree that he does in the Phaedrus and the Symposium, seem like possible, perhaps even likely candidates for those very esoteric teachings. Though exactly how mania and logos, divine madness and logical dialectic, were meant to be integrated into Plato's philosophy remains, and will likely remain forever, mysterious. Curiously enough, the mania play virtually no role in the later Neoplatonic thought of people like Plotinus, and only a very marginal role in the thought of Proclus or Iamblichus. Of course, Plotinus himself accepted the veridicality of mystical experiences. He had several himself and thought they were revelatory of the Divine One. But the mania are never mentioned as the means by which he had this ecstatic vision. And of course, Iamblichus would famously accept theurgia, including enthusiastic theurgia, as a means to philosophical truth. But the four Platonic mania seem to play only a very marginal role in his philosophical program. Of course, Christianity would prove to have very little theological or philosophical room for such a means by which to achieve divine wisdom. Prophecy being fulfilled in its totality by the birth, execution, and the resurrection of Christ. Of course, that's not to say that a Christian prophetic tradition never appeared. It certainly did. One thinks of later prophets like Joachim of Fiore, or the alchemist Arnold of Villanova, and John of Rupischisa, and of course the firebrand Savonarola. But this tradition, despite its great popularity, was often viewed with a great deal of skepticism and active suppression by the Orthodox authorities. As you might imagine, prophetic utterances which claim to know the will of God actively clash with the kind of authority that the Catholic Church wished to establish from its earliest days. This situation would, however, begin to change somewhat with the translation of Plato by Ficino beginning in the 15th century. For Ficino, the Phaedrus became a sort of central key for unlocking the secrets to be found not only in Plato, but in a kind of wider philosophical project itself. And it were the mania, or furores as he translates them into Latin, that became the central philosophical tool for elevating the soul back to the divine good. Through Ficino's career, he would greatly expand upon and systematize Plato's theory of the mania. In his famed letter De Divino Furore, or On the Divine Frenzies, Ficino describes how the soul can become separated from the body in a process he calls the abstractio, and can begin its ascent toward the heavenly realm. Here, the mania are no longer thought of as four distinct forms of divine madness. Rather, they are four moments in a kind of divine frenzy in which the soul is awakened from its slumber and ultimately elevated through a process of greater and greater purification. It is in this process that he refers to as the abstractio, in which the various frenzies are used to liberate the soul back in its journey to the divine. Here, the poetic frenzy liberates the soul through sacred language, before turning it over for purification through the use of the telestic frenzy, in which various ceremonies of ritual purification allow the soul to begin itself to mount up toward the heavens. Next, the soul undergoes the prophetic frenzy, before finally being raptured up into the greatest of all the frenzies, love. Ficino further explains and systematizes his theory of the frenzies in his monumental work, The Platonic Theology. There he explores the frenzies as both a form of spiritual awakening and ultimately salvation. Here the soul is awakened from its error and ignorance through the use of sublime music, then united within itself by various religious ceremonies and purifications, before the ruling principle of the soul is turned heavenwards and regains its prophetic powers. What's interesting to me about this aspect of regaining the prophetic power of the soul is that Ficino in fact invokes the Corpus Hermeticum to make an example of exactly what he means. This is no doubt a thoroughgoingly Christian Hermetic Platonic theology of salvation. Once the soul is reunited with itself and turned heavenward, it is through the frenzy of love that the soul is finally reunited, purified, and ultimately mystically united with the divine source. For Ficino, the mania, or the furores, or the frenzies in this case, become a kind of spiritual therapy. While there is a kind of Hermetic sublimity in Ficino's theory of the frenzies, what isn't clear to me is that he actually attempted to use this spiritual form of therapy, either on himself or in the Platonic Academy that he tried to reestablish in Florence. But what is clear to me is that Ficino does have in mind a kind of practical spiritual means by which to awaken, purify, and redeem the soul. And this would certainly be right for any Hermetic practitioners out there to develop new and interesting rituals modeled on Ficino's own ideas. Perhaps, to that end, River Run Records has actually put out an entire album inspired by Ficino's Hermetic and celestial ideas. I have to admit, it's rather lovely, and perhaps it'd be a good place to begin awakening one's soul. That, or you could give Krauss's record Diotima a spin. Recall Diotima was the great revealer of love back in the Symposium. If Krauss at full volume doesn't wake up your soul, I don't know what will. Link in the description. Progressive black metal aside, Ficino's concept of the frenzies would go on to have a huge impact on the development of Hermetic philosophy in the Renaissance. This concept would be more or less taken up directly into Agrippa's famed 3 books of occult philosophy published in 1533. What makes Agrippa's treatment of the frenzies interesting is that he's perfectly happy to mix pagan forms of prophecy with the kinds of prophecies found in the Hebrew Bible, thus developing and systematizing a highly syncretistic version of the frenzies and prophecy uniting both Hermetic pagan philosophy and Christian theology. Of course, this only made Agrippa's occult philosophy appear more aberrant in the eyes of religious authorities at the time. And while we're given a very interesting analysis of the frenzies in Agrippa, we're not told much in the way of practical knowledge of how to invoke or use them, which is actually pretty typical of Agrippa's 3 books of occult philosophy, despite the fact that it's primarily known as a kind of occult textbook. The same is basically true in Giordano Bruno's 1585 on the heroic frenzies. This rather wonderful and eclectic text focuses on the frenzy of love, and is just as much an expression of that frenzy as it is an inspiration for it. So if you want to engage both the poetic frenzy and the erotic frenzy in one lovely text, then Giordano Bruno here is your guy. Plato's mania, as a means of short-circuiting the divided line, remains a tantalizing alternative to the typical means of logic and dialectic by which one arrives at philosophical truths. And it is in Plato's thinking and in its inheritance that both mysticism and philosophy become kind of twin siblings, both reaching up to sublime truths on their own paths. Despite the fact that modern academic philosophy has basically failed to understand this aspect of its history, and continues to fail to understand this aspect of its history, the possibility of ecstatic, non-dialectical methods by which the truth can be achieved remain an interesting aspect of philosophy's past, and perhaps its future. If you're interested in the history of Hermetic thought, occult philosophy, and mysticism, make sure to subscribe here to Esoterica. These are all mainstay topics on our channel. Also, if you value our work exploring topics in Western esotericism in a free and accessible manner, please consider supporting our work on Patreon or with a one-time donation. Your support makes episodes of Esoterica possible, along with our upcoming seminars and even classes in the future. So thank you very much for your support, your viewing, your commenting, and your sharing of our content. As I mentioned earlier, Plato's chief discussion of the mania can be found in his dialogues, the Phaedrus and the Symposium, and his discussion of his so-called esoteric ideas can be found in Letter 7. If you're interested in Western esotericism, you're probably going to have to get pretty steeped in Plato anyway, so I'd recommend picking up a copy of his complete works as they're published by Hackett. This translation is very reliable, and Hackett is just a wonderful publisher anyway, so that would be the translation I would recommend having, and having access to Plato's complete works are simply necessary if you're going to do further research into Western esotericism. The Locus Classicus for Understanding the Greeks and the Irrational is a text of that title by Dodds. Although I will say, while this text is a classic, and while Chapter 2 on madness remains relatively good, the book itself has aged somewhat poorly. Specifically, I find his discussion of so-called Greek shamanism to be relatively unreliable now, given the enormous amount of research done in that field. I will say again, Chapter 2, his chapter on madness, remains very good. However, the book itself is a bit outdated at this point, but still worth reading. Given the shortcomings of the Dodds text, we're very likely to have Yulia Ustinova's Divine Mania to fill that gap. Ustinova's monograph is now the definitive study of the mania in ancient Greece and is a wonderful piece of scholarship. I can only scratch the surface of the text here, and I have to say this is a highly recommended text if you want to understand the role of alterations of consciousness in the ancient Greek world. Finally, the best study for understanding the role of the frenzies in Ficino's thought is an article by Walter Hanegraaff. Having studied under Hanegraaff, I have to admit I'm perhaps a little biased here, but this article is a clear, systematic appreciation of the role of the frenzies in Ficino's oeuvre, showing the development of the concept all through Ficino's career. So if you're interested specifically in the role of the frenzies in Ficino's thought and in Renaissance Hermetism, this is certainly the best place to begin. To my knowledge, there's no systematic account of the frenzies in Renaissance and early modern philosophy, which seems to be a very fruitful field of research. This is interesting because I think the valorization of the frenzies could be set against the idea of enthusiasm, which was much maligned in the early modern period. As you'll perhaps remember from another episode, Descartes had a series of dreams which inaugurated in some sense the birth of rationalism and modern philosophy. When the existence of these dreams and the importance of them for Descartes' thought was discovered, many people derided Descartes as both an enthusiast and a Rosicrucian. This would include the famed philosopher Leibniz. So I think a fruitful line of research would be the valorization of the frenzies during Renaissance philosophy, but the disparaging of enthusiasm in the early modern period. Especially by looking at philosophers and thinkers who sit uncomfortably between the valorization of the frenzies and the distrust that the early modern period has of enthusiasm. Of course, that's all work for another day, I suppose. Until next time, I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and you've been watching Esoterica, where we explore the arcane side of history, philosophy, and religion.